Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome to this seminar webinar. My name is Mkokeli. I'm a journalist, a politics researcher, and I work with associates at Mkokeli Advisory, a public affairs firm that seeks to help businesses and people who need to understand public affairs, politics, political economy. Welcome to this partnership with the Sunday Times Dialogue. We're looking to look at issues that are affecting the state of South Africa, the region, and South Africa in the global context. We have a powerful lineup for you that will help us go through this topic, threats to democracy from a number of perspectives. They need no introduction to you, as you will see just now. People who are familiar with South Africa are very passionate about South Africa. They played the big part in our history, and they continue to play a big part dealing with the present and leading us to the future. I want to introduce the panelists very quickly. We have Mr. Mzebisi Jonas, businessman, politician, former Deputy Finance Minister, Professor Bani Pichana, former academic, former principal at UNISA. He tells me he is retired. I'm surprised as good as he looks that somebody as young as he looks could be a pensioner. Professor Pichana is a research fellow at my alma mater, the University of Port Elizabeth, used to be called the Nelson Mandela University. We have Michael Sachs. Michael Sachs needs no introduction. He spent time at Lutuli House in the public sector, in the treasury. He's now an adjunct professor at the Wits University. He carries on to write, help us understand threats to the economy, democracy, and the South African future. Kuben Naidu, very fascinating South African, spent time as a very young activist in South Africa. He has the special honor of writing his matric test, incarcerated as a youth activist and fighting for a better South Africa. He's a deputy governor at the Reserve Bank. Philani Mthembu, a close associate of Mkokeli Advisory. He is the executive director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. With their colleagues, Sanusha Naidu, prominent political analyst in South Africa. I have to apologize up front. I would wish that I would have more women panelists, and unfortunately, we have a panel that is not fully representative, and that's not what we are about. We would have wished to have had more panelists. Unfortunately, due to a number of circumstances and issues that came up at the 11th hour. Here we are. I'm going to hand over to Mike Siluma. Mike Siluma, you may remember him. He's the deputy editor at the Sunday Times and a columnist. Thank you, Mr. Siluma.
Thanks, Sam. First, let me welcome everyone, our guests and participants to today's session of the Sunday Times Dialogues, live in partnership with Mkokeli Advisory. It's our pleasure to host today's very important conversation, especially in the context of the events of the last 2 weeks in our country. It is apt, we think, that we pause and reflect deeply on what has happened, because in the most traumatic way, it speaks to our country's unfinished business, which is that of nation building. Its elements entail the following: ethnicity or tribalism. We have to ask why some found it absolutely essential to push back against the president's initial reference to ethnic mobilization in the violence, and why he himself felt it necessary to walk back his initial proposition. Secondly, there is the question of race or of racial tension. By now, we all will be familiar with the many stories of tension in the wake of the violence, mainly between South Africans designated African and those categorized as Indian, and emanating mainly in the conflict in Phoenix and surrounding communities. The other element relates to the issues of the economy. The question of economic inequality in our country. The fourth one relates to the elasticity and durability of our constitutional dispensation, as well as the fitness of our state to play its designated role. The key question here being whether the rule of law can or should apply selectively, depending on an individual's social status or influence, or even popularity. Suddenly, all of the above elements combined to give us the perfect storm that raged through the country in the last 2 weeks or so. At Sunday Times, we therefore proud to host, together with Mkokeli Advisory, today's session. We see our role as being to promote common conversations among the diverse communities and interests that make up our nation about our present as well as our future. Given today's lineup of eminent panelists, we look forward to a fruitful and constructive engagement this afternoon. I'd like to thank you one and all for your participation in today's session.
Thank you so much, Mr. Siruma. I'm looking forward to your column this weekend, and I'm sure you will unpack more of these things in the Sunday Times. Without wasting anyone's time, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, a man who needs no introduction in South Africa and about South Africa. Bramke, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mkokeli, and I must salute also other panelists. I think it's nice to be part of this great occasion. Because I have 10 minutes, I'll try to restrict myself, my input into just 6 big threats that I think we have, South African democracy has. And I'll just shoot through them very quickly so that I don't waste time. The first I would want, I think, is our party political dominance by one party, the ANC. And if you think back in our history during Mandela or even under Mbeki, this used to be not a problem, I think. In fact, the ANC was perceived as a guarantor of our democracy and in many instances, the guardian of our constitution. So much so that civil society even demobilized and defer this role to the ANC. And there's nothing inherently wrong or bad about the one-party dominance in this instance, at least when the party has good leadership, it has vision, and enjoys broad stakeholder legitimacy. Where things get worrisome is when the party loses its way. And I would want to think that in the last 15 years or so, the ANC did lose its way. I've said before that we could not have had state capture if the party was not captured in the first instance. The country is facing challenges, and we not only have to clean the party and the state, but we also have to clean the party itself. And sometimes I think opening up the playing field, having many players is also very important because it also creates platform for ensuring that parties inter-influence themselves. As is the case, I think some of the concepts that find themselves expressed, at least in some sections of the ANC, come for other parties in any case. So opening up the playing field is important, and strengthening civil society becomes even more important. The second element is our infatuation with cult of personality. This is linked to my previous point, obviously. Even since our love affair with Nelson Mandela, and who could blame us for doing so anyway, would have deferred defining our common interests to the individual in charge. Mandela shaped the first period of around national unity and reconciliation. Mbeki shaped his period in office around building a black capitalist class. Zuma, of course, is credited or discredited with state capture. Ramaphosa, at the moment, I think the buzz is for driving reform. The problem with this is that it idealizes and demonizes individuals. And sometimes media plays into this kind of narrative. This is not confined to the ruling party only. I dare say that even opposition parties in South Africa tend to be anchored on this in the culture of personality. And the problem is it defeats the purpose of building broader alliances in society and embedding programs in society and getting them broader societal support. The third element is the rise of national populism and identity politics. The events of 2 weeks ago also showed the dangerous rise of racial and even tribal identity politics, in spite of the denials from some quarters. The Trump years showed that the biggest threat to modern democracy is from within, spurred on by social media and deteriorating living conditions for both the middle class and the working class. Our apartheid history and fragile national unity makes us especially susceptible to racial identity politics. Of course, we can say that the way society reacted was positive, and this thing didn't actually gain national currency. The fourth element is a very real sense of fueling populist identity is pervasive inequality. South Africa is the most unequal society in the world, and unfortunately, this is still mirrored through race. There requires to be a far deeper national dialogue on how to increase Black share of wealth. White South Africans still make up 60% of the elite, with Black South African comprising only 20%. And I think that's a very big issue that is not even reflected in the current debate about reform. The fifth element is, which is directly related to our inability to address inequality, are our very poor human development outcomes. The World Bank Human Capital Index shows that we are only 40% as productive as we could be under optimal health and education conditions. We're performing, I think, worse than most countries, even in the continent. Having 70% of our youth without jobs places democracy in the direct firing line. The second last threat, which I want to raise, is our failure to prioritize growth. Partly, this is rooted in the governing party's love-hate with business, which it views as a major beneficiary of apartheid at times, but also at times realizes the essential role that business can play in the country's development. This expresses in the slow pace of executing reforms, and because I think reforms are seen to be linked to supporting business. It also expresses itself in over-regulation and a host of other measures that actually impede growth in a very serious way. But also another element, our over-dependence on the commodity up cycles and down cycles, I think. And I think diversifying the economy becomes a critical way of responding to this thing. Finally, and linked to this point, the last point about executing reform, is the capacity of the state. Our weakened capacity of the state, I would argue that it's a big threat to democracy. Initially, COVID-19 demonstrated how weak our public health system was. And I think the events of the last couple of weeks also demonstrated how weak our security and intelligence structures are. And I think unless we address this, we actually will continue to face problems. And the bulk of the contradiction is there is over-dependence, growing dependency on government at a time when government is very weak, I would argue. And if we are to drive the reform, we also need strong and very effective and efficient government to drive them. And that's something that I would argue that we have to address. The last part, of course, is that the weak state also goes to local state. Municipalities are in a crisis, and they are they are front line for delivery of services and otherwise. Can I end at this point, Mkokeli, and allow other panelists to talk?
Thank you so much, Mr. Jonas. I wish I could just let you carry on in a number of these topics. I'm sure we'll find an opportunity, and even inviting you to put pen to paper. And in Sunday Times, I'm sure we'll publish your op-ed on Times Live, Sunday Times, and other platforms. I will now hand over to Professor Pichana. Prof, over to you.
Sorry, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Sam, for the invitation, and thank you very much, Sunday Times and Mkokeli Advisory for setting up this webinar, and to do so at this time in the history of our country. I'm struck, I must say, by the theme that has been chosen for this conversation. It's a theme about threats to democracy. What strikes me about it is the negative side of democracy that is being highlighted. For some reason, there was a time when we wouldn't talk about threats to democracy in South Africa, because our entire psyche was about the excitement about democracy, and we were almost impervious to the downsides of democracy in the way in which we constructed our thinking as South Africa post-apartheid. I think, though, that the real value of the theme has been chosen is that it gives us an opportunity, if you like, to reset, to think again, to reflect, given the events of recent times. And I suspect that that is the reason that this has been said, because whatever else you might say about the rebellion at one stage that I'd like to put it, whatever else one might say about it, it was, if you like, some kind of popular expression about the state of our world and the state of our society and the state of our country, at least in part. How does that come about? It comes about, if I may say so, I think in three points I would put as threats to democracy in the time that I've got. The first one is complacency. We South Africans have been quite complacent about our country and what it can offer and what it is built about. And we've been, I think, rather roundly proud of our constitution and the manner in which we were able to overcome apartheid and everything else that went with it, to the point that we engineered a cult of exceptionalism. We began to see ourselves like no other, and we were exceptional in some ways that were very deep. What this did is that it really took away from us the very important vigilance that is necessary, because all democracy is sustained by a vigilant citizenry. Because if we're complacent, then we take our gaze away from the things that matter, and we preoccupy ourselves with the riffraff of inconsequentiality. And because it is, for whatever reason, it is the fad of the time. It is in fashion. It is a thing that makes us feel good. It is what it is at that point in time. And there is a sense I almost want to say, we got to a stage where, with our love for democracy, we've got to a stage where familiarity breeds contempt. We became so familiar with our democracy that we're no longer mindful about the necessities of democracy and its sustenance. We began to take it for granted. I think that's I want to just put that like that and leave it. If you want me to continue, I would. But the second thing is what has been touched on a little bit by Mkokeli, is the tyranny of the single idiom, the tyranny of the single idea. Because of the structure of our society and maybe its history and its past, we've tended to be comfortable with a dominant idea, with the hegemony of a dominant idea. Far too many of us are buying into the dominant idea. And quite honestly, in our society, there seems to be no place for the rebel, the rebellion who questions, the rebelliousness that actually questions the foundations of what we actually do and what we are about. And the hegemony of the single story, the single narrative, the single idiom is so pervasive in the way in which we think through what our society is about and its future, that we are actually, if you like, trapped in that idea of a single idiom, which almost can't get out of it. And in a sense, I'm saying that this is partly what Mkokeli was talking about. He has structured it in terms of a dominant political party in our system of governance. But actually, I think it goes beyond that. It is in various other aspects of life where the rebel actually in our society has no place. You just have to see how contrarian almost political ideas have no place, but it also is a place in other social effects, how we are unable to do so. The third one for me is also a take. I have a different kind of take, if you like, on what Mkokeli has brought. It is a sense of historicism. South Africans love history, but they almost always, we are inclined to have, if you like, a one-track interpretation of history. We see history only in one track. The history has been the evil of apartheid and colonialism, etc., etc. And the history that basically says that we as Black people have overcome apartheid. And look around you, have we? Have we brought any new ideas at all? But also with it is heroes and hero worshiping. And when we hero worship certain people, and you can see it, we are unable, for example, in the naming of places and streets. We name using names of people we regard as heroes. You look about in squatter camps, in shack dwellings, in public buildings and institutions, hospitals. Ironically, we name these places after these heroes, but we promptly ignore them and let them collapse. And we probably ignore the people in the informal settlements, and yet they carry the names of people ostensibly that we regard as heroes. So heroism is a place. Why is all this important? It is that actually at the heart of it, I'm coming to the end now. At the heart of it is that for the sustenance of a rights jurisprudence, modern democracies overlook citizens and the quality of citizens' access to public discourse. Not just the access, but also the capacity of citizens to make the quality of public discourse that they're open to. That becomes the very possibility of their democracy. Put it another way, I'll say that the democratic systems that we have, another side of it is that it is the same democracy that fuels the tyranny of the majority that I've been talking about for so long. Now, the genius of the South African system is this, that we recognized the tyranny of the majority in a democracy. And we set up a constitutional state. Constitutionalism is to provide checks and balances against the tyranny of the majority in a democratic state and in a democratic system. So constitutionalism is the defense of democracy. What has then happened? When we have set up this constitutional system to become the defense of our democracy, we actually have allowed other anti-democratic voices to dominate the meanings of our democratic system, as we have seen recently. Listen to the arguments of the lawyers in the Zuma case, whether it's a rescission or whether is to ask the High Court in Pietermaritzburg to set aside the order for the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma, or whether you listen, the way in which that same democratic system, that same constitutional system has been demonized in recent times, because the democratic system is intended to produce that which others need. Now, philosophically, from Plato otherwise, and to modern Western philosophy and democracy, we know that at the end of the day, democracy works only to the extent that it produces and sustains and upholds all that is good for society. And if democracy is, it is suggested that democracy is that which actually pleases the majority. No, democracy is about the good, the common good, not the good of some, even the majority, but it is one that sustains and produces a common good. It is to understand what that common good is about. Now, I suggest that our constitutional system is precisely about that. It limits the power of the majority. It calls upon the Constitutional Court to be the sole arbiter of our constitutional and democratic values. It limits the power of the president, even though some of us think that that power under Jacob Zuma in particular was hugely abused. But it also means that we've got to the place where we are because we ceased to understand that for democracy to work, we must ourselves be vigilant. So the anti-liberal, the anti-democratic defense of democracy is what has brought us to this place where we are. I think that once we recognize, this is my last point, Sam, once we've recognized that, then we can begin, like we did, recognizing the history of where we come from. We then put together a constitutional system that actually checks and balances all the time. We need to reset right now to really begin to really understand what is it. This moment has given us an opportunity to really chart a new course for our society, for our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. That was really, really powerful. Just to remind the audience that questions are very welcome. You can just drop them on the live chat. There is one already coming from Arena Morrison. They want to know, where can individuals find their agency? Where can they see themselves as active citizens in terms of an active citizenship system and that can allow us to have solutions? I will hold on to that question. We'll come back, but I'm happy to take questions as we go along. I will now pass the baton on to Michael Sachs.
Thank you, Sam, and I have a really difficult task of following that profound wisdom from Bani Pichana. And what is important about it for me is the underlying optimism that animates that input. In the sense that if people can find their agency, democracy can work, and we can find a way out of the challenges that we face today. And I suppose what I have to say is a bit dismal, or it's a dismal response to this, because I think from an economic point of view, much of the 20th century was about development. And probably the simplest definition, kind of statistically, one can make of development in raw economic terms, is that your per capita income is catching up with the per capita income of the most developed economies in the world. So you are becoming developed. That's what development is. And I think in the period after African independence and after the independence of colonies, there was this idea that the former colonies would become developed, that the future that they could look forward to is the future that had been attained in Europe and the US, where poverty had been eliminated, where society, it became possible for, in a sense, people to flourish in society. And I think there are two things important about this. The first is that, by that definition that I gave, South Africa has been moving in along a path of de-development for generations, really since, I mean, I was born in 1971. I know Kuben was as well. We both recently turned 50. And this was a turning point in world history, not because me and Kuben were born, but for other reasons, although that was important too. But it was a turning point in world history. And since that time, since the global economy changed in the early 70s, South Africa has been moving, went into a space of economic decline. And that decline was very strongly grounded on the economic and social policies of apartheid. And it was very clear that that's why South Africa was declining. And then the answer to that problem appeared very clear, that the answer is to overcome this apartheid system, this political system of apartheid, install a democratic government, and then the economic rewards would flow. And unfortunately, this has not been the case. Unfortunately, the trajectory of a declining economy, moving further and further away in economic terms and in terms of national wealth, further away from the frontiers of global development, becoming less and less wealthy as a nation. That trajectory has continued. It was interrupted briefly in the early 2000s. And we had thought that the reason, we had interpreted that interruption as a change in trajectory. We had thought that indeed the 1994 transition had resolved the underlying problems. We put in place world-class institutions, good macroeconomic policies, all of the things that we are advised to do, we did. And we thought now we are reaping the benefits of this good work that we have done as South Africans. But in hindsight, it's clear that that was not the case. What actually happened was we had a temporary commodity boom, which made it look like we were on a new path of development. But as soon as that temporary commodity support was removed around 2010 after the World Cup, we resumed this path of slow growth, decline, and since then we've had declining per capita income, or stagnating or declining per capita income. So in a sense, I think we continue to be on the trajectory we've been on since 1971. The difference now is that we have a democracy, and we have a constitution that proclaims a vision of a rising floor of social and economic rights. But we are attempting to attain that vision in a material reality of increased deterioration, a falling floor of economic resources. So, and I think that we are now in a world, in an era of world history in which this idea of development, this idea that the former colonies will become like their colonizers is no longer very credible. We've seen China and the East Asian countries break out of where they were, and for certain reasons, and under conditions, not very democratic conditions, change their position in the world economy. But when we look at Latin America, when we look at Africa, the idea that that the next period of history is going to be one where we're going to catch up and reach these development frontiers is not one that is very credible in my view. Instead, we face a protracted period of remaining where we are and confronting ourselves and looking at ourselves in the mirror and accepting ourselves for what we are. And I think in a sense, that is the silver lining behind the events of the last few weeks. That, it's a very difficult time right now to judge the direction we are traveling, because things are both unusually bad and unusually good. They are unusually bad because our South African politics is in a very painful place, and the unrest that we've seen over the last few weeks is fresh on our minds. They are unusually bad because of the COVID pandemic, and because we're all sick of lockdowns and the economy is sick of lockdowns. But they are also unusually good because we again have the support of a commodity price boom and a terms of trade shock that is making our tax revenue outperform. And it is very difficult to judge the trajectory on, because we don't know what the permanent effects of the unusually bad situation are going to be. We don't know what the permanent effects of COVID are going to be. We don't know whether the economy that comes out of COVID will be one that permanently employs much fewer people, particularly in services, in aviation, in tourism, in hospitality. We're yet to see what are the permanent effects of this temporary shock. We could say the same about the unrest and violence, that we can rebuild the infrastructure that was destroyed, but the permanent effects on our sovereign risk premium, on our interest rates, on investment in our economy are very difficult to judge. On the other hand, the short-term positive of the commodity boom, we can be pretty certain will come to an end at some point. And so I think I could go on, but I'll stop there by saying I think, and I want to maybe pick up on what Bani Pichana said about South African exceptionalism, that I think we are very different in many ways, and we often make this mistake of not understanding our differences from the rest of the world and simply in a kind of cookie cutter fashion adopting blueprints from somewhere else on the assumption that they would work here. So it's important to remember how we are exceptional. But on the other hand, I think this moment is one of us recognizing that we are a normal developing society. A normal developing society with mass unemployment and poverty and extreme inequality that is here to stay. And we need to, and this is normal. When I say normal, because this is normal across Latin America, it's normal across much of Asia and much of Africa to accept these realities as permanent and attempt to construct a democratic society in that context. So I think maybe democracy is the one thing that we can be proud of, not because it is going to place us on a path of development or resolve our economic problems, but because many societies are poor, unequal, and undemocratic. And the fact that we are able to sustain this democracy in these socioeconomic conditions is something to be very proud of and to cherish and to build on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Sykes. Very interesting and thought-provoking, and it's quite scary as well, having to look at ourselves in the mirror and accept who we are and what it is that we are. Quite a scary experience, that considering all the painful difficulties and all the opportunities associated with South Africa and being South African right now. I now move to Kuben Naidu, Deputy Governor at the Reserve Bank. Thank you, Mr. Naidu.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon, Sam. You know, if Michael had a tall order following Mkokeli Jonas and Professor Pitiana, then I have an even taller order. In reflecting on how to deal with this topic on threats to democracy, I want to deal with the theme, a worrying theme that runs something like this. Well, you know, I've got a really bad situation. I don't know how to get out of it, so let me break everything. Right? It's in history, there are two parallels. Prior to about 1850, most medical treatment involved bleeding the patient. Right? I mean, taking out an extraordinary amount of blood. Scientists had no idea why this was done, but this is what most medical treatment prior to 1850 involved. There was no science about it. There was no evidence about it. People thought it worked. In some cases, the patient died. People said, he would have died anyway. In some cases, the patient got better. You know, perhaps they would have gotten better anyway. But a completely unscientific approach effectively involves saying, well, you know, we don't know what to do, so let's do something. Post-94 in South Africa has been, and particularly in the last few years, has been a bit like that. So the narrative in South Africa runs something like, you know, 27 years, it's been a pretty big failure. We've got a lot of poverty, a huge degree of inequality, an extremely high level of unemployment. Effectively, we failed as a democratic state to reverse the effects of apartheid. So let's break everything. Let's just smash everything. You know, let's tear up the constitution, let's tear up the social compact, let's tear up democracy, let's tear up the institutions. And, you know, I want to start off by saying that that's absolutely the wrong way to go. Right? I'm not pretending that everything is right. I'm not pretending that everything is perfect. And I'm not pretending that all the institutions and all the rules and all the laws are correct. But an approach that says, well, you know, Mandela sold out in 94. The constitution that we are negotiated is an elite compact. Let's just tear it all up. Let's just break it. Let's just smash everything. Let's destroy the institutions that we've created because they haven't delivered. I think that that's absolutely the wrong way to go. And I do think that that is the biggest threat to democracy. Right? The biggest threat to democracy is people saying democracy has not delivered. It has delivered 46% youth unemployment. So let's break democracy. Right? I think that that is the big danger in the South African narrative. I would like to argue, perhaps foolhardily, I would like to argue that we have built some really solid things. We have made some solid progress. We have elements of a foundation upon which we can build something better, as opposed to destroying everything and attempting to start over. The second historical parallel is Pol Pot, right? You go around and you burn all the books and you kill all the intellectuals. because there's a high degree of inequality and the intellectuals are rich, right? That is a Pol Pot approach to development. And there's a lot of people in South Africa now saying, well, let's just adopt a Pol Pot approach to development. There are some good schools, well, let's break them. There's some good hospitals, let's break them. There's some parts of our economy that work really well let's destroy them. Right? I want to argue that that's not how countries progress. That's not how societies progress. Societies progress by fixing the thing that's wrong, but keeping the things that are right. Right? South Africa is a small open economy bobbing around in a huge global economy. We've got a lot that is positive. We've got a lot that's good. We have to build on that to rectify the ills of the past, right? To rectify the mistakes that we've made, to deal with the developmental challenges that we have. Our constitution introduces a democracy. It's not a perfect document, but it's a credible document. It was done by a credible process, right? Of course, the big worry is as unemployment rises and inequality rises, the credibility of that very cornerstone of our democracy will come under threat, and calls to break that will grow increasingly loud. I want to argue that actually that is not the main task of society. The leadership, the task of leadership, the task of the elites in South Africa is to essentially to recognize that we have a solid foundation upon which to build. That constitution that we have is a solid foundation. The democracy that we have, the gains that we have made, economic, social, and in human development are significant, but also to recognize that we have made insufficient progress, that there are major flaws in our economy, that there are major structural weaknesses in our economy, that there are elements of our state that are broken, there are elements of our public service that must be remade and must be rebuilt. And working, that requires leadership, right? It requires leadership to protect what is good, but to use those resources to fix and to deal with the inequalities that we have, to deal with the unemployment that we have. Because both scenarios, a scenario that says, well, we've got 46% youth unemployment, so let's break everything. But also a scenario that says, everything's fine, everything's hunky-dory, let's not change anything. Both scenarios are fraught with disaster. Right? I think the task of leadership in South Africa, the best way to protect democracy, to safeguard democracy, is to accept that there are certain parts of our social compact, there are certain parts of our legal underpinning, that whether we all like them or not, we've got to live with them, we've got to put up with them, and we've got to find solutions to them. All the rules, all the laws, all the every minutiae of policy is not right. There are many aspects that are wrong. There are many aspects that are changing. But if we adopt a rule that says, well, because I don't like this rule, because I don't like that policy, because I don't like that outcome, it's perfectly acceptable for me to go on and break everything. I think that that's actually populist. I think that that's quite an easy solution, an easy way out. And the tough job of leadership is to say, hang on a minute, that institution is important for our long-term sustainability. Let's not break it. In 1994, total employment in South Africa was about 12 million. We managed to get that up to about 16 million. Right? It's now back at about 14.8 million. The fact that we have 14.8 million people working is a terrible indictment of the slow progress that we make. But it will be a really stupid outcome to say, well, we've only got 14.8 million people out of 40 million adults working, so let's break the economy, let's destroy everything. Right? And I believe that the Constitution imposed an incredibly difficult challenge on us. Right? That those words, heal the divisions of the past and established a society based on democratic values, recognizing the hurt of the past, the injustice of the past, and doing something to rectify it, but also building a society where all South Africans enjoy a future, enjoy equal rights. It's an incredibly difficult balance. It's quite easy to say, well, let's chastise whites because we've made insufficient progress with development. It's quite easy to not to want to do something about the inequalities of the past. It's quite easy to flip to, a DA view that says, well, we're all in a race. Let's get rid of affirmative action. Let's get rid of BE. Let's all run this race equally. Both outcomes are a violation of our constitution, a violation of our founding principles. And I think as hard as it is, as difficult as it is, we've got to steer that very delicate balance between healing the divisions of the past, building on what works, and creating a better society for all. Thanks, Sam. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Kuben. It's very powerful. And we move to Philani Mthembu, Dr. Mthembu, at the Institute for Global Dialogue, the Executive Director. Fascinating positioning comes from following these trends in South Africa and with our neighboring states, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Zambia. Over to you, Dr. Mthembu.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you for putting this important conversation together. So I'm going to frame my 10 minutes around 6 key points. The first one is really around the framing of the recent events. The second is around the process of nation building and social cohesion. And there I'm really asking whether we've left nation building and social cohesion to the market. Have we taken a laissez-faire approach to nation building? The third point is around rebuilding the capacity of the party and the state. The fourth is around addressing inequality, poverty, and unemployment. The fifth point is around political participation and the nature of protests in South Africa. And the fifth point is really, the sixth point is really around the regional implications, looking at South Africa in the world. So the first, colleagues, is just on the framing of recent events. We've seen several terms being thrown around, insurrection, attempted coup, counter-revolution, uprising of the poor, anarchy, civil unrest, looting spree, riots. All of these terms, if those terms were being thrown around by ordinary members of the public, simply trying to make sense of what is happening, I think that would be understandable. But the concern that I have is that these are terms that are being thrown around by those in our system of governance who are in a privileged position to have more access to information, to intelligence, people who you would understand meet regularly, discuss challenges within our country. And I think the concern there was that if amongst those in political office, if there is no consensus or agreement on how to actually characterize what we have seen in the last few weeks, that is quite concerning, and it simply adds to the confusion within the country, but it also adds to the confusion outside of our country. You could imagine, so how are we communicating to the international community? Are we saying that South Africa has survived an insurrection? Is that the discourse? Is that the framing of recent events? Are we happy with that? Are we happy with that? If we think in 5 years, 10 years time, is that how we're going to be teaching in our schools in the evolution of South African society? Are we going to be teaching as the formal narrative that we have just survived an insurrection? Now, of course, if it was an insurrection, and that's provided by clear evidence and that is explained to the society, I don't have any issue with how this thing is framed. But I do think there needs to be, at least amongst our leaders, there needs to be a consensus on this issue, and it needs to be clear. So the confusion that we saw was quite troubling, if I could put it that way. The second point really around nation building and social cohesion is really a critique that arguably we could say that we have had a laissez-faire approach to nation building and to social cohesion. The events of the past few weeks have showed us the cleavages within our society. They have shown us, this lack of cohesion, but they've also shown us that if we don't have a concerted, forward-looking, a very deliberate process of nation building, then we run the risk as a country of going to the first point I mentioned, of as a society not even being able to agree on one coherent narrative as a country of where we come from, where we are, and where we are going. Because essentially everyone does their own thing. There is no center that is driving the process of nation building, of really building a cohesive society. So that is something that is important. And you don't build a nation by pronouncements. You build it at a community level. You build it through the education system. You build it, through various programmatic issues that are run throughout the society. And it's a deliberate action. The society understands that we are building a nation. We are trying to come about with a certain process of building social cohesion. And I think if we leave that to the market and we adopt a laissez-faire approach, then society can unravel very quickly and very easily. And we've seen some of that in recent weeks. The third point is really about the importance of rebuilding, the capacity of the party, but also the capacity of the state. This is quite important because if you go through all the political reports of the ANC, it's very clear where its problems are as a political party. It has been very honest in disclosing its own problems to society. However, in terms of actually operationalizing whatever recommendations that are out there, it's been very weak at implementing its own resolutions. So we've seen a process where, for instance, where the party has opened up the gates and, let members in without the necessary processes and institutional frameworks within the party for political education. And it's almost, it's too easy, for anyone to become a member of the ANC and ascend to political office without necessarily going through political education, without necessarily an assessment of skills. And we're seeing a similar thing unfolding within the state, where I would argue that the state, yes, the weaknesses of the state have been very clear for everyone to see. But those weaknesses are not because the country lacks skills and capacity. In fact, there is capacity all around the society. One example to emphasize this point is that if you look at the reports of our municipalities and you look at the amount of funding that is actually going to consulting firms to assist municipalities with their accounts and with various issues, it's actually quite shocking. But it's not shocking for me because of the amounts we're seeing flowing there. It is shocking because what it tells me is that the state is not utilizing its own capacity And what do I mean by that? There is capacity within the university system. There is capacity within various structures of society. However, we are not utilizing that capacity that exists within the state. So you would rather see the state going out to, the private sector and asking for certain things to be done than to go to its very own institutions that it is subsidizing through the higher education system and actually sourcing that capacity there and utilizing that capacity to fix some of the governance problems we are seeing in society. So in the path to rebuilding the capacity of the state, it is also going to be important to understand what is the nature of the state and to understand that we are not utilizing all the skill set that exists within the state. The next point is really around how our inability to do all of those things have been exacerbating the challenges of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And that if we are to address those challenges, we will really have to, to really reshape our development path. But reshaping our development path does not mean going again, to a KPMG or to a McKinsey and asking them, to draw up some, framework that the country might need to embark on. No, it means going and reshaping our development pathway. Yes, utilizing the expertise, but also going on the ground and understanding what are the challenges that society is facing at a community level, at provincial level, at a national level. And then, coming up, bringing all that together and understanding that this is the pathway that needs to be followed, but then acting on, those recommendations, because it's useless having, piling up with a list of recommendations, which there are many in South Africa, without actually implementing those those recommendations. The fifth point is really around the issue of political participation in South Africa, is that if we look generally and at a comparative level, South Africa has had relatively high levels of participation when it comes to elections. However, we are starting to see troubling trends. One of them being that in the previous national elections, we had about 18 million voters who were eligible to vote, but did not go to vote. Out of that 18 million, 9 million of them did register, but on election day, they did not go and vote. Out of that, another 9 million were eligible, but did not go and register. That tells us that the political parties are not speaking to a very important section of society. And that section of society, when they become angry, how are they displaying their anger? Are they going to the booth, the voting booth, to actually show their anger? Or are they engaging in, destructive practices to display their anger? This is something that we need to pay attention to. That we need to be bringing that 18 million into the fold and getting them involved in the political processes. The last point is that everything we've seen in South Africa has a major implication in the region. I was in Eswatini recently, and one of the things that we saw immediately driving from the airport is the fuel shortages. And they were quite obvious, these fuel shortages. You also started having shortages of other goods in the different markets. So whatever happens in South Africa has implications in the region, and obviously vice versa. And I think it's going to be important for not just South Africa, but for the region to get its house in order, because we're seeing events, spiraling in Eswatini. We're seeing, what's happening in Mozambique. We're seeing, obviously, the ongoing and protracted challenges in Zimbabwe. And I would say that despite the issues that South Africa is facing, that should not necessarily make South Africa seek to isolate itself from the broader regional context. Just because you're having challenges in your country does not mean you should no longer become an agent of change within the region. In fact, if anything, it should show the region that yes, South Africa is not perfect. There is no South African exceptionalism. And therefore that should open up an open dialogue between South Africa and the region to say that if we don't fix issues of governance, if we don't fix issues of inequality, if we don't create the necessary value chains within our region to absorb our populations into the labor market, then what we will end up with is a region on fire. And that will not be good for South Africa. It will not be good for the rest of the region. So with those words, colleagues, let me end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mthembu. Really, Philani, I was hoping you'd leave us on a positive note and not so scary an outlook. But thanks for that. It helps us to deal with these things in a very real manner. We have a question from Tony N. Tony N, I think it's Tony, I'll call him Tony, and probably represents the initial of his last name. Tony wants to know and asks if democracy has been force-fed on us as South Africans, and in the sense that we did not create or define our own form of democracy that is entrenched in African culture. Is that one of the issues that we need to grapple with? That's a question from Tony. I'm going to move and throw that question around, and I'm going back. I'm holding on to Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha is going to be our sweeper. I'm holding on to Sanusha, and then I need to go back. I'm going to take the speakers 2 minutes each. I'm afraid to say goodbye. We're wrapping up. We'll make sure that we're done by 2 p.m. so that everybody gets back to carrying on with their day. I need to go back to Professor Pityana. Professor Pityana is going to be followed by Ben Naidu. Professor Pityana, your inputs, please. How do we absorb all of this, and what is to be done?
Sam and colleagues, thank you very much. Thank you for those presentations, by the way, everybody, very enlightening. I look forward to seeing some of that made more publicly available. Let me just say where I come from. There are certain things that, we didn't get to know last week, that there is a problem of inequality and poverty and gap in this country. Year after year, with each conference and NEC and all of that, the African National Congress always says that they are focusing on the gap between the poor and the rich in this country. But actually, we haven't really got any serious program that is designed to address those issues beyond rhetoric. So for me, I don't come from the perspective which some people do, that say that the events of recent week were caused by poverty and inequality. That for me is given, because that is the nature of our society. That is the defining characteristic of our society. Equally, to have said that we are the protest capital of the world, that's not rocket science, because actually we've got a large number of able-bodied, young, energetic men and women in our society, in our communities, who hang around the street corners for days and are not gainfully employed, and they may be resentful. It may be important for them to get an excitement from time to time. That seems to me to be such an obvious thing. Any government worth its salt would have already designed a way of addressing. And frankly, what I'm saying, the issue is not about giving 350 rand to the unemployed, however important that is. It is actually to train and to skill that 48% of young South Africans and provide them with the means whereby they can develop for themselves jobs as small and medium enterprises that the state actually gives some support for. That, I think, is the kind of thinking, because 350 rand is woefully inadequate in our environment. I'm not saying it's useless, it's not useless, but it is inadequate. But what we are not getting, and that's what I'm looking for, what we are not getting, Kuben, is a thing that actually says that we are on a drive. I mean, I'm thinking, after 1976, if my recollection serves me well, I was in jail most of the time, so I may miss out some things. I've got gaps because I was in prison. What I think is important, after 1976, the then apartheid government did two important things, as it were, in response to the first, they established the Independent Development Trust, IDT. That was established as an independent development trust to do something about the housing and the communities and the life of the communities to be improved as much. The second thing they did, they established 8 universities, 8 campuses of Vista University in different parts of the country, in the townships, in the African townships. So by that alone, they managed, I think, to redirect the energies and the intellectual capacity of many people in the communities towards the issue of education and skilling and looking after the environment in the communities where people were actually living. Now I'm saying that this moment is calling on us and our government to really think, what is it that is critical to make a difference, a critical difference for the ordinary South African. If we have a diagnosis what the problem is, unemployment surely is, hopelessness and despair definitely is. People without a future who believe that they have been let down by the very idea of a new democratic constitution. What is it that we're doing? Now, I have a sense, if you allow me, that we've run out of ideas. If ever there were, we've got a government that has no ideas anymore. It's run out of ideas altogether. And therefore, I'm saying, my sense is that we are here, we need to really put on our thinking caps, and really begin to think afresh and rethink where is it that this country and this nation is going. Look at the moral and ethical prevalence of our societies and equip our people to become their own development agents, as Michael Sachs said. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prophet, for your inputs earlier, and it's very, very sharp, beautiful tale you just shared with us as to wrap up your input. Kuben Naidu, over to you.
Thanks for that. I don't think there's a silver bullet, right? I mean, I do think that the priority has to be to focus on employment. The priority has to be to try and get the economy growing, to get investment back, to get confidence up, and then to move that economic growth, to move that dial, to be able to make the economy more labor absorbing, labor intensive, and to use the resources to build, as Professor Pitiana says, build the skills, invest in education. So one of the successes of the post-apartheid era is the very, very dramatic increase in Black African university graduate enrollment, right? the number of Black African people graduating from university is rising by between 4 and 6% a year. That's pretty rapid by international standards. Off a low base, but it's rising pretty rapidly. And it's something we've got to build on. We also know that university enrollment, the reason why the fees must fall protest was so virulent is because university enrollment is almost guarantees you a job. You know, I make this joke that South Africa's university, and I'm not talking about TVET or FET colleges, South Africa's university unemployment rate is about the same as Germany. You know, people complain about unemployment graduates. Actually, it's about as low as Germany. If you've got a degree in biblical studies from Turfloop, you've got a pretty good chance of getting a job. Right? So unfortunately, that was the only thing that actually worked. We've got many more people through the system. And you know, I think that's an example of a success, right? And we've got to build on that rather than break it down. I think what we've done in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years is to say, okay, fine, the university system is working. Let's force them to take 2 times, maybe 3 times more people, and let's underfund them, right? And you know, to solve the problem. That's not a solution. I think you've got to build on what you have. You know, our schooling system is making slow incremental progress that is way too small, right? There's, in fact, part of the money that was shifted to fund free education, free higher education, came from cutting school budgets. Cutting the budget for pit toilets in schools was cut and was given to universities. Those are some of the choices we've made over the last few years. So I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think at the end of the day, the massive social programs that we're running, and it's absolutely essential that we run them. The social grants program, the housing programs, free education, free water, free sanitation. The social wage is an absolutely essential part of our development strategy. It is insufficient if you aren't able to get 3 or 4% economic growth a year, and you aren't able to create 400,000 or 500,000 jobs a year. Now, yes, we did that, but during a commodity boom, right? But effectively, that's what countries do, right? I mean, to quote an economist by the name of De Kiewit, an economic historian who wrote in 1947 that the only 2 things that matter in South African economic data is commodity booms and political blunders. And he said this in 1947, right? Little has changed, but it's about how you use those skills, how you use those resources to build and build and build, right? Effectively, I think we've got a political establishment that is extremely ambivalent about capital. It's extremely ambivalent about money. It's extremely ambivalent about business people. Well, yes, we want business people. We'd like your investment. We'd like you to create jobs, but actually you mean evil, nasty, racist. Right? I mean, it just doesn't work. Right? I'm not arguing that business practices are all great, that businesses are committed to transformation. But the problem is that if you want business, you want investment, you got to understand them. You got to understand their needs. You got to understand their demands. And I think there's insufficient focus in South Africa on the very basics: business confidence, getting that right, getting investment right. You know, I mean, we've had an absolutely diabolical situation around spectrum allocation that's dragged on and on and on. You know, some people argue it's elite capture. We've had year after year after year about debates in the mining sector about once empowered, always empowered. The effect of this is you've got no mining investment. You've now got one of the longest commodity boom, not longest, sorry, one of the biggest commodity booms, absolutely no change in output, right? No change in mining investment. Right? We've got a huge continent. South Africa is able to produce a food surplus. There are not many countries in the world, not many countries on the African continent that are net food exporters. We've done pretty well, but we can do a hell of a lot better. But you've got to resolve the policy contradictions, the policy uncertainties that will actually encourage people to invest, encourage people to create jobs, encourage people to make money, make a return. Unfortunately, that's what it requires. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, Kuben, and also the reminder of that quote. I remember in previous interaction, you took us back to this quote about this, the persistent nature of South Africa's problem going back to 1947, being said back then. But as a historian, I'm quite keen to go back to read up a bit more on that. Can I then please take back Dr. Mthembu? Dr. Mthembu is to be followed by Michael Sachs.
Yeah, thank you. I think, what we shouldn't be doing is saying our problems are because of our democracy. I think, that goes back to what other colleagues were saying, that, you basically, that type of approach does not necessarily build. In fact, the type of democracy we have, you hear people saying, associating democracy with the West and all of that. But historically, that's just not a fact. In fact, our democracy came through endogenous processes. The reason why we have your Bill of Rights, the reason why we have all these rights enshrined in our Constitution is because we understood very well the arbitrary nature of being discriminated against based on arbitrary measures, whether it's race, whether it's gender, or whatever it may be. So we have to own our democracy. It is our democracy. It is an African democracy. In fact, it goes further than a lot of the things enshrined in our Constitution go further than even what you find in Europe and in the US and others. So but we have to find a way to make sure that the beautiful things that are enshrined in our democracy find expression in the material conditions, of the people. So I think that's quite important. And then I think also, thinking about the analogy of a region on fire is to also think that after a big natural fire, you have regrowth, you have new life, in a forest environment. And I think this is what we should be focused on now, is how to then rebuild as a society, how to make sure that we are utilizing the full skill set presented within the country. The analogy of the uptake of in our higher education system, of graduates. This is a positive thing, and we've had many positive things over the past 27 years. But the key question is the state ready to say all of that potential and the skills we have built over the last 27 years? Are we ready to allow that energy, that new thinking, to take this country forward? Are we ready to take a few risks, and to experiment with certain development ideas, try things, in certain municipalities and try to expand them at a broader level? There's a lot of energy we've seen, and there's a lot of expectations for where the country could be. The question is, can we channel that expectation? Can we channel that energy towards building rather than destroying?
Thank you very much. We'll move straight to Prof. Sachs. What is to be done?
In an attempt to offer something different, I think a lot of the discussion hinges on the state and what are the policy interventions needed to right the situation. And I want to push back on that in two forms. The first is that I think the underlying fundamental problem is that we live in a divided society. And there are many respects in which it has become increasingly divided and is becoming increasingly divided. So if you look at Gauteng, is increasingly, if you look at the demographic shifts over the last 20 years, It's increasingly of the affluent intergated communities that increasingly don't depend on the municipality for services, on the one hand, and a huge influx of population into what are called backyard shacks in the townships, far away from these areas of economic opportunity, on the other hand. This has been the nature of our urban development over the last 20 or 30 years, has been to increase segregation. Fine, we broke down Group Areas Act, but and I'm not talking about racial segregation necessarily, I'm just talking about the sense that we are increasingly becoming divided in our living spaces. The same is true for our education system. The same is true for our health system. The same is true for our system of security. In each of these social spaces, we have a public system which services the ghetto, and a private system which services the affluent. And I would suggest that in those conditions, you cannot have a good public education system, or there are limits to how good the public education system can be if, as soon as you attain some decent level of living, the first thing you do is to take your children out of that system and into a private system. So if we wanted to, and then the second thing is kind of the policy proposal. I think what is lacking is a vision and a political momentum behind a vision of a common society. That all of the people that were looting a couple of weeks ago clearly don't have a vision that they can buy into of a common society. And I think that's what we've lost. And that is more important to regain than any particular policy objective, is some sense of a vision of a common society and a preparedness to make life a little uncomfortable, including for affluent South Africans, on the path, on the road to achieving that vision of a common society. Because at the moment, a lot of the discourse is the state is so bad, the RET people are so bad, Black people and the poor are so bad. Should we give them grants, or should we give them, I don't know, something else? And I think what is often missing is a sense of, okay, so don't the affluent whose life builds, including ourselves here, whose life essentially builds on the foundation that apartheid laid, in creating a divided society in which the affluent could live these first world lives. Don't they have to make any sacrifice in this process, or it's all just, no, the state, we've given you our taxes, now fix the thing and leave us alone. So I think the key challenge is to reignite a vision of a common society.
Thank you so much for that. And then we move to Mr. Jonas. Mkokeli, over to you, and then we get Samisha immediately after Mr. Jonas.
Okay. Look, I mean, I think this has been a very interesting conversation, Sam, and I think all speakers, I think touched on what I think are critical factors facing us. But it's very clear, I think, if you think about it if you like technical terms, what needs to be done. On the one level, you need robust implementation of growth-enhancing reforms, plus some measures of reducing inequality in a robust way than we've ever done before. In order to do that, you need a very strong state, and you need better collaboration between business and labor and government, etc., in doing those things. I think that's pretty much clear. I think we can quibble on what is contained in the package, but generally, I think what needs to be done, I think across ideological lines, divides, and political divides, you could get an agreement. And I want to come back to what Michael had said. The issue is a vision, but I want to add that until we actually orchestrate a process of national dialogue, so that at least there is a shared perspective and vision for the country, and we rely less on political party to deliver that vision. Because I think, let's face it, all political parties have credibility challenges in a big way. So some form of like active citizenry, mobilization of civil society organization, of course, including political party, to work through a national dialogue that begins to kind of shape a new vision for the country and a reset in terms of programs, and maybe taking a second look at our accountability frameworks, et cetera, And maybe that's probably what will defend democracy, so that we begin to define a stake for everybody in what's happening. So my point is, I think we need to really orchestrate a process towards a national dialogue. That's where the trade-offs could be made. I mean, that Michael is talking about. You could have trade-offs, I mean, from the trade-offs from the rich, the poor, and trade-offs from the working class, and trade-offs from those who are in government and political parties in terms of what direction, what to give in to the process of shaping a new agenda for the country. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, and really looking forward to marching alongside you and many others who are passionate about South Africa towards this national dialogue. Sanusha will wrap up, and I won't be coming back once she's done, and that is, I would like to thank everyone who's listened in on the website and the YouTube and Facebook. Particularly thank you to the Sunday Times, Arena Group, my associates at Mkokeli Advisory, who've made this all possible, Mr. Mike Siluma, Deputy Editor at the Sunday Times, Sebisi Jonas, Professor Pichana, Michael Sachs, Kuben Naidu, Kilani Mtembu, Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, over to you, and it's goodbye from me.
Thank you so much, Mike. Sam, thank you, everybody. I mean, good day to everyone. I won't want to go over the time frame that Sam has set in terms of a soccer match, so I'll try and wrap up, but it's been such an incredible discussion that I don't think I'm going to do justice to all of the contributions and the rich debates and the rich insights that we've got. I think what I've picked up is 3 or 4 key trends and themes that came out of this roundtable discussion. I think the first one was really around understanding our structural conditions, both from a political and economic context. And this is where Mr. Jonas's understanding of the structural conditions and the 6 points he made, the interface between party, the one dominant system versus the kind of discussions around personalities, the rise of nationalism and these identity questions and the pervasiveness of inequality comes back to our political structural conditions and the kind of interface this has with the economy. I think it led very nicely to Prof. Patiana's point about identitional power that we have in South Africa. How much are we thinking in terms of trying to create the narrative, but not to create the narrative in the same old rhetoric, but the narrative that takes us beyond that rhetoric of just trying to find what the diagnosis is, but try to find the prognosis and go forward. And I think that came out very strongly in terms of where do we go to, how do we fix this in terms of the how. And that identitional power is very important because we can't keep going with the single idiom of how to understand things from a historical perspective or the historicism. I really enjoyed the way Michael Sachs brought out the political economy in this whole discussion around the economic perspective, the political economy around poverty, inequality, the linkages within development narratives around the 90s and the 1971. And I think there was something very important there, that the start of the global development agenda and how that began to unfold linked to South Africa, but also linked to the rise of Thatcherism and Reagan economics in the 1980s, which again brings us to the point of a very fascinating book that I've read called The Precariat, and where this precariat is in terms of what was the narrative in 1994 in terms of the political economy and the declining kind of we shall seek, using Kwame Nkrumah's famous quote, seek your political kingdom first and all else will follow. I think it was a very important dynamic in there. I really thought Kuben Naidu was, as much as he may have been a bit pessimistic, I think he kind of gave us a sense that there is something very optimistic about our democracy. And it's basically how do we understand that level of engagement with our institutions, with our constitution. But more importantly, I think he says, let's fix what's here. Let's try to reinvent what we have, or try to move it in a way that means that we don't necessarily throw everything out with the bathwater. And I think that was very critical as well in terms of understanding and recognizing that there are going to be flaws in any democracy. It's not perfect, but let's go forward in that context. And I think Palani brought us back very nicely to the interface between the domestic and the international. Whatever we do in South Africa has repercussions, has reverberations in how the world sees us and how we actually anticipate our positioning in the world in terms of our international engagements and so forth. And I think it's not something to be looked at in a negative way, but how do we improve our governance architecture? How do we make sure we utilize our capacities going forward? And I think to end on this point is really the question for me going forward is the how, the capacity, the consistency, the cohesion, and the nation building, but really coming back to a critical point, and that is these social spaces we're talking about in terms of where we are. We have to ask ourselves is how do we reimagine the social contract in society? And in addition to the national dialogue, I think it's also about that relationship of the common vision that we need to have for society. So I'll end there, and I want to say thank you very much to the organizers as well as to the speakers. And I suspect that this is going to be a first in many discussions and dialogues that Sam will coordinate and moderate. Thank you.